It was supposed to be a fun, mindless road trip. Me, 2 friends, and my beat-up Jeep Cherokee packed with snacks, camping gear, and enough gas station junk food to feed a small army. We weren't heading anywhere in particular, just driving through the dusty back roads of the Midwest, looking for nothing and hoping to find adventure. The first strange thing happened not long after sunset on the second night. We were somewhere in Nebraska, on a narrow road that cut through endless fields of corn. The only light came from our headlights and the eerie glow of the moon. The air was heavy, sticky, and silent. "Pull over," said Matt, the jokester of the group. "I gotta take a leak." "Hold it," groaned Sarah from the back seat, scrolling through her phone. "We're in the middle of freaking children of the corn country." "No thanks." But Matt insisted, so I pulled onto the shoulder. He wandered a few yards into the cornfield, muttering something about privacy. Sarah and I stayed in the car, exchanging nervous jokes about scarecrows and chainsaws. And then, the screaming started. It wasn't Matt. It was too high-pitched, too raw. A shrill, almost animalistic wail tore through the night, echoing off the fields and making every hair on my body stand up. Sarah froze, her phone dropping onto the seat. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. Before I could answer, Matt came crashing out of the corn, wide-eyed and pale. He stumbled toward the Jeep, waving his arms. Go! Start the car!" he shouted. I didn't need to be told twice. My hands fumbled with the keys, adrenaline kicking in as I threw the Jeep into drive and hit the gas. The tires screeched as we tore back onto the road. Matt was shaking, barely able to form a sentence. It's out there," he gasped. "What's out there?" Sarah demanded, her voice trembling. He didn't answer, just kept staring out the back window, his face a mask of terror. We drove in silence for the next hour, every so often glancing into the side mirrors, half expecting something to burst out of the darkness and chase us. Eventually, we found a small roadside motel, the kind where the neon sign buzzes and half the letters are burnt out. It wasn't exactly inviting, but it was the only option. We checked into a single room, locking the door behind us and piling furniture in front of it for good measure. None of us wanted to talk about what happened, but as I lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling tiles, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. Something that didn't belong on the side of the road or in the cornfields. We didn't sleep that night, and by morning, I realized that the trip we'd started so eagerly was about to take a turn none of us could have imagined. We left the motel early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as we threw our bags into the Jeep. None of us spoke much. Matt looked haunted, his face gaunt and pale. Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder, like she expected someone, or something, to be watching us. I didn't say it out loud, but I couldn't shake the feeling either. The plan was simple. Keep driving, stick to main roads, and get as far away as possible from that cursed cornfield. But as we pulled out onto the highway, something felt off. The GPS was glitching, spinning the map like a roulette wheel. Every time I glanced at it, it showed a different route, rerouting us back toward the fields. "It's broken," I muttered, smacking the screen. "Just keep heading west," Sarah said, her voice tight. "We'll figure it out." An hour passed and then another. The landscape grew more desolate, the fields stretching endlessly in every direction. We hadn't seen another car since we left the motel. No houses, no gas stations, just miles of rustling stalks. That's when we saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was a scarecrow, its body too thin, its posture too stiff. But as we got closer, I realized it was a man. He was tall, gaunt, and dressed in clothes that looked decades old. A threadbare flannel shirt and dirty overalls. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his face hidden under the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. "What the hell?" Matt muttered, leaning forward in his seat. I slowed the Jeep, my palms sweaty on the steering wheel. The man didn't move. He just stood there, blocking the road, his hat casting a shadow over his face. "Go around him," Sarah whispered. I eased the car onto the shoulder, the tires crunching over gravel as we inched past. My eyes stayed locked on the figure, half expecting him to lunge at us. He didn't move, but as we passed, I caught a glimpse of his face, or rather, the lack of it. Beneath the hat, his skin was smooth and featureless, like a mannequin. I floored the gas. The Jeep shot forward, the road blurring beneath us. Sarah was shaking, her hand clutching the door handle. Matt was dead silent, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "Did you see that?" I stammered. "Don't talk about it," Sarah snapped. "Just drive." We drove for hours, too scared to stop. The sun climbed higher, but the landscape never changed. It was as if we were trapped in some kind of loop, the same fields, the same empty road. And then, just as the sun began to set, we saw it again. The figure, standing in the road, exactly as before. This time I didn't slow down. I swerved onto the shoulder, narrowly avoiding him as the Jeep skidded back onto the asphalt. The figure didn't flinch, didn't move. But as we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him turn to face us. "Is he following us?" Matt asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said. "I don't care. We just need to get out of here." But no matter how far we drove, the figure kept appearing. Always ahead of us, always standing in the road, as if he was leading us somewhere. The fear in the car was palpable, choking. We didn't speak anymore. We just drove, hoping, praying, that the next bend in the road would lead us back to civilization. Didn't. By the time night fell, we were nearly out of gas. The road narrowed, winding through a dense patch of forest. The trees loomed over us, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The headlights barely cut through the darkness. And then the engine sputtered. The Jeep slowed to a stop, the dashboard lighting up with warning signals. We were stranded, in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "We have to find help." Matt nodded, though he looked like he wanted to be sick. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The air was colder than it had any right to be, biting through my jacket. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes your own breathing sound deafening. "We stick together," I said, trying to sound confident. "No one goes off on their own." But as we ventured into the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that somewhere, in the darkness, the figure was waiting for us. The forest was wrong. Not just creepy in the usual way that dark woods can be, but deeply, fundamentally wrong. The air had a stillness that didn't belong to nature, like the whole world was holding its breath. Even the flashlight beam seemed to struggle against the darkness, barely illuminating the gnarled trees and the uneven ground beneath our feet. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. "None of us do," Matt muttered, his voice thin. "But we can't just sit in the car and wait for whatever that thing is." We trudged on, the crunch of dead leaves and snapping twigs the only sounds breaking the silence. Every few steps, I swore I could feel something moving in the shadows, just outside the reach of the flashlight. My heart was pounding, my grip on the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. Then we saw the house. It loomed out of the darkness, a crumbling relic that looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The wood was warped and splintered, the windows were boarded up, and the roof sagged under the weight of time. Yet there was something about it. A faint glow coming from one of the windows, the faintest curl of smoke rising from a crooked chimney, that suggested someone was still inside. "No way," Sarah said, shaking her head. "I'm not going in there. Do you want to stay out here instead?" Matt shot back, his voice trembling. "Because that's where it is." I didn't like the idea of going into the house any more than Sarah did. But Matt had a point. We couldn't stay in the woods. Not with the figure following us. "Let's just check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "If it's empty, we can figure out our next move. If someone's there, maybe they can help." The porch creaked under our weight as we climbed the steps. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the cold breeze. I pushed it open, and the three of us stepped inside. The air smelled damp, like rot and mildew, and the floorboards groaned with every step. The flashlight beam swept across peeling wallpaper, a toppled chair, and an old grandfather clock that had stopped ticking long ago. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing eerily in the empty space. No answer. "Let's just look around quickly and go," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't like this." We moved cautiously through the house, staying close together. Every room was the same, dusty, decrepit, and abandoned. But there were signs that someone or something had been there recently. Footprints in the dust, a broken plate on the kitchen floor, a half-burned candle still flickering weakly on the mantel. "Guys," Matt said suddenly, his voice sharp. He was standing at the base of a staircase, his flashlight aimed upward. "Do you hear that?" We froze, straining our ears. First, there was nothing, just silence. But then, faintly, we heard it. A slow, rhythmic creaking, like someone rocking back and forth in a chair. The sound was coming from upstairs. "Let's go," Sarah hissed, already backing toward the door. But Matt was staring up the stairs, his expression unreadable. "What if they need help?" "They don't," I said firmly. "Matt, don't." Too late. He was already climbing the stairs, the creaking growing louder with each step. I had no choice but to follow, Sarah clinging to my arm as we trailed behind him. At the top of the stairs, the sound was deafening. The rocking, back and forth, back and forth. It was coming from the last room at the end of the hall. The door was cracked open, light spilling out into the darkness. Matt reached the door first. He hesitated for just a moment, then pushed it open. What we saw froze the blood in my veins. It was the figure, sitting in an old rocking chair, its back to us, the brim of its wide-brimmed hat just visible over the top of the chair. The rocking stopped as soon as we entered, the sudden silence so complete it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. What do we do?" Sarah stammered, her voice shaking. Before I could answer, the figure began to rise. It moved unnaturally, its limbs unfolding in jerky, disjointed motions, like a puppet being dragged to its feet by invisible strings. It turned to face us, and for the first time we saw its face, or rather, the void where its face should have been. The darkness beneath the brim of its hat seemed to ripple, pulling at the edges of reality itself. And then, slowly, it began to step toward us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah and bolting for the stairs. Matt was right behind us, his footsteps pounding against the old wood. But as we reached the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The locks turned on their own, the doorknob twisting violently. We were trapped, and the figure was coming closer. The door wouldn't budge. I pulled and yanked with every ounce of strength I had, but it didn't even rattle. Matt was frantically searching the windows, trying to pry one open, while Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the room, her wide eyes fixed on the dark staircase behind us. "It's coming," she whimpered, her voice barely audible over the sound of my own hammering heartbeat. "Move, Sarah," I yelled. "Help us find a way out." But she didn't move. She just stood there, shaking her head, her lips quivering. "It's here." I turned. The figure was at the bottom of the stairs. Its hat brim was tilted just enough to reveal the blank void where a face should have been. A swirling, black nothingness that seemed to suck the air out of the room. It wasn't walking so much as gliding, its limbs hanging limply at its sides. "Upstairs," I shouted. It was a stupid idea, but it was the only option. At least we could barricade ourselves in one of the rooms. We bolted up the stairs, the figure gliding after us at an agonizingly slow yet relentless pace. Every door in the hallway was shut except one, the room with the rocking chair. I hesitated, but there wasn't time to think. We rushed inside and slammed the door shut behind us. "Block it," Matt shouted. He grabbed a dusty dresser and shoved it in front of the door. I joined him, my muscles screaming as we wedged it tight. Sarah crouched in the corner, hugging her knees and mumbling incoherently. For a moment there was silence. No creaking floorboards, no heavy breathing, no sound at all. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the door, like someone politely asking to be let in. "Stop!" Sarah screamed, covering her ears. "Stop it!" But the knocking continued. Louder now, harder. The dresser began to rattle, and a deep, guttural noise filled the room. A low growl vibrating through the walls, through my chest, through my teeth. "We're gonna die," Matt said, his voice flat, defeated. "No, we're not," I snapped, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "There's gotta be another way out." I shone my flashlight around the room, desperate for an escape route. And then I saw it, a small, square window high on the far wall. It was tiny, barely big enough for a person, but it might work. "The window," I pointed, already scrambling toward it. "Help me." Matt snapped out of his daze and ran to my side. Together, we pushed a rickety old desk under the window. I climbed up and shoved the window open, the cool night air rushing in. "You go first," I told Sarah, helping her to her feet. "Hurry." She didn't argue. With Matt and me boosting her up, she squeezed through the window and disappeared into the darkness outside. Matt went next, his broad shoulders barely fitting through the narrow frame. Just as I started to climb out, the door behind us splintered with a deafening crash. The dresser slid across the floor as if yanked by invisible hands, slamming against the wall. The growling was deafening now, filling every corner of the room. I turned my head, just for a second. The figure was there, standing in the doorway, its hat tipped back to reveal the churning black void of its face. For the first time, it moved quickly, lunging toward me with a jerky, inhuman speed. I dove through the window. The fall wasn't far, but I landed hard on my side, pain exploding in my ribs. Matt and Sarah pulled me to my feet, dragging me toward the tree line. Behind us, the figure climbed through the broken window, its long arms reaching for us. We ran. Through the trees, through the darkness, tripping over roots and branches. The growling followed us, louder and closer with every step. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. Feel the void pulling at the edges of my mind, threatening to consume me. Just when I thought we couldn't go any farther, we burst out of the woods and onto a gravel road. Headlights blinded us, and the sound of an engine roared in my ears. A truck skidded to a stop, the driver jumping out with a flashlight in hand. "What the hell's going on?" he shouted. "It's after us," Matt yelled, pointing back toward the trees. The man looked, his face pale in the harsh light of his flashlight. "Get in. Now." We piled into the truck, the growling so loud now it felt like it was inside my head. The driver floored the gas, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the woods, its blank face turned toward us. It didn't follow, but I knew. Somehow I knew it wasn't over. Nothing that wrong ever lets you go for good. The truck sped down the gravel road, its engine roaring like it was being chased by the devil himself. I sat in the back seat, clutching my ribs, each breath a sharp stab of pain. Sarah was next to me, her face pale, her hands trembling in her lap. Matt was in the passenger seat, constantly twisting around to look out the rear window. The driver, a grizzled man in his late 40s, kept glancing at us with a mixture of suspicion and concern. "What the hell were you kids doing out there?" he asked, his voice gruff. "We got lost," Matt said, his voice shaky. "Something was following us." The man's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "You're lucky I found you. People go missing out here all the time. Some are never seen again." That didn't make me feel any better. The gravel road eventually gave way to cracked asphalt, and after what felt like an eternity, we saw the faint glow of civilization ahead. It was a small town, barely more than a few streets clustered together, but it was a lifeline. The driver pulled into a diner parking lot, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the darkness. "Come on," he said, putting the truck in park. "You need food, water, and a phone to call someone." We stumbled out of the truck and into the diner. The interior was dated but clean, the kind of place where the smell of coffee and fried food clings to the walls. A bored-looking waitress behind the counter gave us a once-over and raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. The driver handed her a few bills. "Get these kids something to eat." We slid into a booth near the back, the bright lights and warm air a strange comfort after the nightmare we'd just survived. The waitress brought us coffee and plates of greasy food, but none of us had much of an appetite. "I'm Frank," the driver said, sitting across from us. "Now, what exactly happened out there?" We hesitated. How do you explain something like that without sounding insane? "There was a man," I said finally. "Or, not a man. It didn't have a face. It followed us for miles. It trapped us." Sarah cut in, her voice shaking. "In this house. We barely got away." Frank leaned back in his seat, his expression grim. "You're not the first to see it. That got our attention. This thing," he continued, lowering his voice, "it's been around here for decades, maybe longer. People say it shows up on the back roads or out in the fields. Sometimes it's just standing there, watching. Other times," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Other times what?" Matt pressed. Frank hesitated. "Other times it takes people, drags them into the woods, or into places they don't come back from. Some say it's not from here, that it's some kind of shadow or void that doesn't belong in this world." A cold chill ran down my spine. "Why hasn't anyone stopped it?" Frank let out a bitter laugh. "How do you stop something that isn't human? The few who've tried either went missing or came back wrong." "Wrong," Sarah whispered, her face pale. Frank nodded. "They're not themselves anymore, like something else is wearing their skin." The table fell silent. The weight of his words pressed down on us, suffocating. "What do we do?" I asked finally. "How do we make sure it doesn't come after us?" Frank leaned forward, his eyes hard. "You leave. Get as far away from here as you can. And don't look back." We didn't need to be told twice. After scarfing down what little food we could manage, we thanked Frank and headed back to the Jeep, which Frank had towed into town for us. He even filled the tank, refusing to take a dime for it. "Stick to the highways," he said as we climbed into the car. "Whatever you do, don't stop until you're far from here." We drove through the night, the small town disappearing into the distance behind us. The highway felt like a lifeline, its steady hum beneath the tires grounding us in reality. But even as the miles stretched on and the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That somewhere, out there in the endless expanse of the Midwest, the figure was still watching. Waiting. It would never stop. It would never let us go. Because nothing that wrong ever does. We drove until the sun was high in the sky, the bright light doing little to shake the weight of what had happened. The endless road stretched before us, the flat landscape blurring together in a haze of golden fields and distant power lines. It was quiet in the Jeep, each of us lost in our thoughts. Matt broke the silence first. "Do you think it's really over?" Sarah scoffed, though there was no humor in it. "Did that feel over to you?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Frank said to get as far away as possible. That's exactly what we're doing. So yeah, maybe it is. But I didn't believe it. Not really. We passed a few small towns, refueled at a gas station, and loaded up on bottled water and snacks. Every interaction felt surreal, like the normalcy of the outside world was a cruel joke. How could life just go on when we knew what was out there? By mid-afternoon, we'd crossed into Colorado. The air felt different, thinner somehow, as if the mountains in the distance were trying to pull us closer. For the first time since we'd fled that cursed house, I started to relax. Maybe the open road really was putting space between us and it. And then we saw the car. It was an old sedan, sitting abandoned on the side of the highway. The driver's door was open, the hood up, and the trunk popped. At first glance, it looked like a breakdown, but something about it didn't feel right. The car was too clean, too pristine, as if it had been placed there on purpose. "Keep driving," Sarah said quickly, her voice firm, but Matt leaned forward, squinting at the car. "Wait, is that blood?" I glanced at the road as we passed, and my stomach twisted. There was a smear of something dark trailing from the open door into the tall grass by the shoulder. "We're not stopping," I said, pressing harder on the gas. "Someone could need help," Matt argued. "If they needed help, they're already gone," Sarah shot back, her voice rising. "Did you see that trail? We're not getting out." I agreed with her, but Matt wouldn't let it go. "What if it's a trap? What if..." It's setting traps now. That thought chilled me to my core. I didn't respond, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if the figure wasn't just following us? What if it was hunting us? We drove on, leaving the abandoned car behind. The landscape grew rockier as we neared the foothills, the golden fields giving way to jagged cliffs and winding roads. The setting sun painted the horizon in fiery reds and oranges, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. And then, just as night fell, the Jeep's engine sputtered. "No, no, no," I muttered, my hands gripping the wheel. The dashboard lit up with warning lights, and the car began to lose power. I pulled onto the shoulder, the engine coughing one last time before falling silent. "You've got to be kidding me," Matt groaned. Sarah was already panicking. "We didn't stop at the car, but now we're stopped anyway? This isn't coincidence." I popped the hood and stepped out, the cool night air biting at my skin. The engine looked fine, at least as fine as it ever had, but the Jeep refused to start. Every time I turned the key, the engine clicked weakly, as if the life had been drained out of it. "This can't be happening," I muttered, slamming my fist against the steering wheel. "It is happening," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. "And you know why." Matt stood at the edge of the road, his flashlight sweeping over the surrounding area. "Guys, do you hear that?" We fell silent, straining our ears. First, there was nothing, just the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. And then, faintly, we heard it. A low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere in the darkness. "It found us," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Get in the car," I shouted, though I knew it was pointless. The Jeep wasn't going anywhere. The growling grew louder, closer. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement, something shifting in the shadows by the treeline. It wasn't the figure, not this time. This was something else. Two glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, followed by another pair, and another. A pack of wolves, or something that looked like wolves, emerged from the shadows, their sleek bodies and glowing eyes too unnatural to be real. "Run!" Matt shouted. We didn't need to be told twice. Leaving the Jeep behind, we bolted down the road, the growling and snapping of teeth close behind us. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't dare slow down. Just when I thought we couldn't go any farther, we saw lights ahead. A small cabin, nestled at the edge of the trees. Without thinking, we ran for it, throwing ourselves against the door and pounding desperately. "Let us in," I screamed. "Please." The door swung open, and an older man with a shotgun stood in the doorway. He took one look at us, then past us at the glowing eyes in the darkness. "Get inside," he said, his voice grim. We tumbled into the cabin as he slammed the door shut and locked it. He didn't ask questions, didn't even look at us. He just stood there, shotgun in hand, staring at the door as the growling outside grew louder. "They've been following you, haven't they?" he said finally, his voice low. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because he already knew. The growling outside the cabin grew louder, more feral, as if whatever was out there knew it was just a thin wooden door separating us. The old man stood resolute, his shotgun aimed at the door, his eyes cold and calculating. "They always find a way," he muttered almost to himself. "But we've got a little time. Start talking." We told him everything, about the figure in the cornfield, the faceless man on the road, the abandoned house, and now the wolves with glowing eyes. He listened silently, his expression never changing. When we finished, he nodded grimly. "I've seen it before," he said. "Not just the wolves, but the figure, the whole damn thing. It's part of this land, something ancient, something wrong. People like me, we call it the Hollow One. It doesn't stop hunting once it's marked you." "Marked us?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The man nodded. "It's not just a random curse. You saw it and it saw you. That's all it takes. You're tied to it now." "Then what the hell are we supposed to do?" Matt demanded, his voice cracking. "Run forever?" The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. "You don't outrun it. You have to confront it." "You're insane," Sarah hissed. "You want us to go after that thing?" No, I want you to survive, the man snapped. And that won't happen if you keep running. Feeds on fear, on hopelessness. The more you flee, the stronger it gets. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in my chest. So what do we do? The man gestured to a hatch in the floor. I've got something down there, something older than the hollow one. A binding ritual. If you can get it to show itself, we can trap it. But you'll have to draw it here. My stomach dropped. You're kidding. He shook his head. It's the only way. Otherwise, it'll hunt you until there's nothing left. The plan was insane, suicidal even, but we didn't have a choice. The man explained what we needed to do. Light candles, draw symbols in salt, chant a series of words that didn't sound like they belonged to any human language. He handed me an old, leather-bound book, the pages brittle with age. Don't stop reading no matter what happens, he said, his voice firm. And don't let the symbols break. We set to work, our hands trembling as we prepared the ritual. The wolves outside grew more restless, their claws scratching at the door, their growls echoing through the cabin. I tried not to think about what would happen if they got in. Finally, it was ready. The old man stood by the door, his shotgun raised. Now we call it, he said. How? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. You already did, the man said grimly, nodding toward the window. We turned, and there it was, the hollow one, standing at the edge of the clearing. Its faceless head tilted slightly, as if it were studying us. The wolves parted for it, their glowing eyes fixed on the door. It's here, Matt whispered. The old man didn't hesitate. He threw the door open, firing a deafening shot into the air. Come on, you bastard, he roared. The hollow one moved, gliding toward the cabin with unnatural speed. The wolves followed, their snarling filling the air as they charged. The man fired again, but it didn't slow them down. Start the ritual, he yelled. I dropped to my knees, the book shaking in my hands as I began to read. The words felt heavy in my mouth, like they weren't meant to be spoken by humans. The candles flickered wildly, the symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. The hollow one entered the cabin, its void-like presence sucking the air from the room. The wolves circled the ritual, snapping and howling, but they couldn't cross the salt. The old man fired again and again, his shotgun booming, but the creatures kept coming. Keep going, he shouted, reloading frantically. The room grew colder, the light dimmer, as if the hollow one was draining the very life from the space. My voice faltered, the words catching in my throat. Don't stop, Sarah screamed, clutching Matt as they huddled in the corner. I forced myself to keep reading, the words spilling from my lips in a frantic rush. The symbols glowed brighter, the air crackling with energy. The hollow one stopped, its head tilting again, as if it were curious. Then it lunged. The old man threw himself in its path, the shotgun clattering to the floor as he collided with the faceless entity. For a moment, they struggled, the man's screams mixing with the unearthly growl of the hollow one. And then it was over. The man collapsed to the floor, his body lifeless, as the hollow one turned its attention back to us. But the ritual was complete. The symbols flared with blinding light, the candles igniting in a burst of flame. The hollow one recoiled, its form distorting, unraveling like smoke caught in a vortex. The wolves howled, their bodies dissolving into nothingness. And then silence. We sat there, stunned, the smell of burnt wax and ozone heavy in the air. The old man's body lay still, but his face, calm, peaceful, told me he'd known what he was doing. It's over, Matt said, his voice shaking. It's really over. But as I looked out the window at the dark forest beyond, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. Because something that wrong doesn't just disappear. Not forever.